Hi everyone, welcome to the CREX and Kansas webinar series on researching the far right method and ethics. My name is Audrey Gagnon and I am a professor at the School of Political Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And I am also affiliated with the Center for Research on Extremism and the Canadian Network for Research on Security, Extremism and Society, so Kansas and CREX. For those who don't know, this webinar series aimed to facilitate a discussion on the ethical, methodological, political, personal, practical, and professional challenges involved in researching violent extremism and terrorism. These webinars are offered on the third Thursday of every month. So for today's webinar, we are very happy to host Catherine Tebaldi. Kat Tebaldi is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Luxembourg. She is PI of the Marie Speyer Excellence Project, Digital Traditionalism, which look at anti-gender discourse in Luxembourg and Switzerland. So in her talk, Kat will recount their research for the recently published book, Alt Education, on conservative and far-right women and the use of motherhood and maternity in right-wing media and digital organizing. So she will conclude with a reflection on how her research changed as she became a mom and the ethical and methodological consequences of this. So she will present, and then we will keep the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if you have any question at any time during the presentation, just write them down using the Q&A button below the screen, and then we will address them at the end of the webinar. So Kat, whenever you're ready.
Okay. How did I up?
This is always a moment where people need to find out to share the screen.
Can you am I sharing hopefully I'm sharing a screen okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm glad that I'm not here in a digital methods capacity. So thank you so much, Audrey, for having me in your series. After having seen some of these other speakers' great lectures, I'm doubly honored to be invited. Today I'm going to talk a bit about what is now, I realize, 10 years of researching far-right femininity. But a bit from the very personal and very exhausted perspective of the mom of a 6-month-old. So while this does, I hope, give me some more emic insight into far-right motherhood, this is in no way going to be a call for ethnographic empathy or that we need to somehow agree with the right. Instead, I want to trace ideological codes, the shift in critical feminist perspectives on the right, or in more emic language, the realization that trad wives are just leisure mogging me and we should nationalize Ballerina Farm. So, one of the central areas of my research for the past years has been on far-right constructions of femininity, specifically this idea of reducing women to our reproductive role. For the right, we have two kinds of women, mothers and bad, and other understandings of our worth, roles, and value are excluded or even demonized. So, from the racist mother of the nation to the Christian's holy mother or the pagan traditionalist's archetype of the woman is the literal and the symbolic mother. And this role and this restriction to it seem to me to be shared across the right and kind of defining the right wing and reactionary politics. So, this idea of woman as the literal but also the symbolic mother is a role which links her reproductive role to atavistic tradition, to the timeless shared destiny, which we have been ripped out of and cast into modernity. In a recent special issue of Science and Society that I co-edited with Elise Kramer, we looked at the way gender is always chronotopized. So linked to places and times, it's modernity, it's the West, it's tradition, it's the home, and always to these narratives of its restoration. I looked at what I'm calling Pearl nationalism, but this is actually a term invented by Lacey Lauren Clark, a far-right influencer who is also known as the original badass trad wife. I note that many trad wife influencers, I'm sure you're familiar in this audience, but women who dress up in vintage clothing and create media, mostly from their homes that celebrate anti-feminist and often white nationalist talking points. They have styles and forms of beauty which communicate as much as their discourse, evoking a particular place and time as ideal domesticity and implying that this is the space to which we need to return. But I noted that each one kind of has a different tradition, a different place or a different time in their media. We see English cottages, American cabins, 1950s suburbs, medieval Europe. Was it that each tradwife could not agree when the golden age was? Or was it, as I argue in this paper, that taken all together, they were showing that across time, a woman in the home is a deeper and truer tradition, kind of a deeper unity among all these different historical moments? It's kind of the woman's eternal return to the kitchen. But if women are embodiments of eternal tradition, we are also, on the right, kind of like household appliances. In a paper in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, I looked at how far-right discourses kind of took that bun in the oven metaphor a little bit too seriously, defining women through a series of repeated comparisons to domestic sexual labor and laboring machines. I look at the invention of complementarianism, which is a development of Christian patriarchy that argues that men are not better than women, women are not worse, we're just different in nature. However, men have the nature of being leaders, and women have the nature of being followers, and men have the nature of being better, and women have the nature of being worse. So, what I argue is that if, in Christian patriarchy, and if you would ask me, I would say probably in most of the world, most of the power systems of the world, gender becomes a difference of power and domination. But here it has to become and be made into a difference of nature, of personality and character type through a semiotic process, that is, through language. So I looked at books about how to be a good woman and how in these books the submissive role is given content through repeated prescriptions that begin at the smallest level. What kind of fabric you should wear, what kind of threads it should have, what kind of colors it should have, what kind of knits it should have, that all of these should become expressive of a kind of softness that is also kind of a metaphor for the softness and submissiveness of a good woman. And this goes all the way up to the biggest thing, so the whole outfit, but also how you act, how you vote, how you believe, these kinds of things of the husband is the president in the home. So we kind of link from the smallest thing, the thread of your dress or the kind of spice in your dinner, all the way to the largest level of the political organization of the nation. And these over and over and over again, we see the linking of physical characteristics to personality traits over and over, so they seem to belong together. So the warmth of a hot meal, the warmth of a good personality, and the essential role of women serving food or serving men politically in the home. Or reiterating the gestational function, so the warm, the nurturing personality, the bun, the oven. So if far-right discourse celebrated motherhood as a sacred font of meaning, it really does also kind of call women ovens. So Matt Walsh, the theocratic fascist, will argue that we have womanhood in every cell in our body and it's sacred, and this is why he, has such horrible transphobia. But he'll also say that we are like ovens. We are essentially vessels which transform. So this work looked at the discourse which established seemingly natural, traditional, or sacred gender divisions, and this all got a bit intense for me last September when both my book and my daughter came out. So in this next part of the talk, I want to explore how my understanding of far-right motherhood deepened through the research of this book, before talking a bit about how it shifted as I had my own kid. So the first thing I noticed in the research for this book, which is available now with Routledge, tell your libraries, tell your friends, is that motherhood was really a kind of meaning. The woman I spoke to in the year of ethnographic research in New Orleans and the suburbs around it, and in the online far-right communities, all agreed that motherhood was a sacred role of soul pouring, nation defending, bloodline inheriting, and light bringing, a level of drama and bombastic language and deep belief that was teeth clenchingly embarrassing. And when I say that motherhood was meaning, I don't just mean that they had kind of dramatic language, oh, my babies are my purpose, the children are the future. I found that they really thought it was meaning. They saw themselves as the main character in a great sacred story. They felt their role was a kind of expertise, like a teacher, a sacred one with sacred knowledge, the love of God, the purpose of life, and that they had a duty to pass this on and protect this child from other forms of knowledge, from the state, from the left, from the globalist conspirators, etc., right? So they were terrible people. But these women were also smart, well-read, loving mothers. And for most of them, this idea of being limited to motherhood was like saying, oh, I'm limited to being a genius, a supermodel, or God. And this last part, almost literally. So mothers were the main character in this story, right? So for example, for my fieldwork in churches in the US South, right, on Mother's Day, there would be these large laudatory sermons in which all the new mothers would be invited up to the stage in front of this congregation of hundreds and hundreds of people, with lights and music, like a rock festival almost, right? Like a really bad, like a John Mayer or something rock festival. And they would be celebrated by the preacher. The sermons would include these biblical models of womanhood. They would celebrate the mother, the women of Esther, the Proverbs 3:11 woman. They would even celebrate the motherly qualities of God, right? So the mothers become, just on this day, somehow like God. And the women would go up, they would hold their babies to be loved on and introduced and celebrated by everyone. Whereas when I had my kid, I got a box of nipple covers, a plate of hospital salmon, and a bunch of unwanted advice about bouncing back and getting my pre-baby body. So, there were some reasons why these women would become so invested in this particular identity, in this particular role. And some processes, some narrative processes, some semiotic processes that would permit this investment. So if moms are the main characters, this story centers the mama bear, right? They're in the story of the loving mother who is also the free-thinking radical, the dissident. One of the women in my book is called Dissident Mama, and she fights the system to save her baby. So you can see why people are getting into this narrative of being a mom, but being a dissident, being a free thinker. This is a story that united so many diverse right wing and far right groups that I looked at, from trad wives to Christian nationalists to neo-Confederates. And it undergirded also their notion of education as a sacred mission of racial and cultural reproduction. So I term these stories metapolitical fables I sort of composite stories which I wrote, drawing on many different interviews to represent mothers in kind of a single narrative and to describe how they were all kind of coming to assemble, put together all their small stories into like a great big kind of fairy tale about being a mother, which might go something like this. Homeschooling can be a sacrifice. You have to give up on the selfishness of career, the extra money, the dinners out, the fancy dresses, all that attention. But once you have kids, you're not the picture anymore. You're the frame. And homeschooling is an act of love. They just don't get it. The school, some cold-voiced femocrat, that's my word, is a feminist bureaucrat. Like the Democrats are a demon rat. Uh, oh, okay. So this big-nosed fat feminist called again to ask if my littles were doing okay. It's a welfare check to social credit check, more like they wanted to know what I am teaching and if I'm doing it right. Who's this school to tell me I don't know how to teach my own kids? They were born and I love them. I've loved them since they were born and I love them since before that. I teach them everything, how to tie their shoes, how to eat, how to walk with God. I feed them from my own body. I built them. I love them. I love them more than anything. Mothers are natural teachers. I teach them to love. I teach them to love God, to love their families, to love their country, their history, their freedom. This is what being an American is: loving your family, loving your freedom, knowing you are born in the greatest history, the greatest country in the world. We are a beacon of freedom around the world. I want to pass this on to my kids. This is their heritage, and I pass this on to them with my love. Who are these condescending experts? And who are they? How can they do better? Schools are institutions, and institutions can't love kids. These are spinster shrews attacking the family. They are attacking love. These days, a mom has to be a mama bear. She has to defend her boy from the schools who hate them. She must teach her girls to be moms because the schools lie and say moms don't exist anymore. They're just parents. So this is a made-up story taken from many different interviews, but kind of to give you the sort of sense and the thrust of what it's like to talk to many and many of these women over time. Uh, and over time, what I notice is that the women in these stories describe themselves as nature's teachers and the passing on of sexist, racist discourse as an act of love, loving your kids and teaching them what to love. But this isn't only love. Or better, what I learned is that love in this curriculum is about what they would call the ordinal affection. So teaching the kids what to love and in what order. So motherhood love here is about instilling hierarchy, an intimate hierarchy. Mother is above child, father is above mother, God is above everyone. And it's about the act of instilling this hierarchy in the hearts of your kids. So love is the central theme across each of the interviews of the mothers. Of course, you talk about your kid, you're going to talk about love, right? But it wasn't just a matter of affection. It was what the Christians would call soul pouring, in which both love but also Christian values were given to the child in education. Love could not be separated from these politics nor their hierarchies, as when Christian Reconstruction would cite the biblical dictum that women should love men the way men love God. I actually once had an ex-boyfriend tell this to me, which was really terrifying, and obviously why he was an ex. So the result of a mother's love is that the child's moral virtue, their soul, it's learning to love, it's learning to love the right things, God, the nation, the opposite sex. When one of the women I interviewed, we call her Christine, she asked what was the most important lesson she wanted to teach her daughter. She explained that it was for her how good it was to be a mother, for her to love her biblical womanhood. While Erica, answering the same questions, said that she would teach her son to love his heritage as a white American male. And it went almost without saying that they should all learn to love God. So, wrapping this up, then, motherhood makes you the main character in a deeply meaningful narrative, a sacred heroine for God or the white race. And for the moms I spoke to, this kind of narrative was really a love story. But let us not forget that these are not nice ladies. These are Christian nationalists, neo-Nazis, eugenicist hippies, or neo-Confederates. Here we see one of the women I researched, dissident Mama. She is a neo-Confederate, but it's worth remembering also that there are better mamas like Sojourner Truth pictured below, and that this is a fight to see motherhood and womanhood beyond a narrow vision of white femininity, which is, has long historical roots and has always been important. And then again, neo-Confederates like dissident mama are not the dissidents. That term should be reserved for those who use motherhood against power and not for it. So in this last part, I want to return to a critique of far-right's equation of motherhood and womanhood, looking at this now as a fight over what both of these terms mean. Because here's the thing, right? That having a kid is actually like unbearably cool. And also, so is hating fascism or being a scholar. I want to start to revisit the formulations and critiques of far-right femininity from this position of both understanding how meaningful motherhood is and then disagreeing even more with the meanings that they make of it. Right, so what does it mean to think about being an Antifa wine mom or researching far-right mom, right? I mean, this is obviously a Fox News invention, but it would be very cool, I think, to be an Antifa wine mom. So I'm getting finally at the end to the original title of this talk. What does it mean to be researching far-right motherhood as a mom? I think this question is first and foremost a really practical one. How does one research awful stuff that keeps you up at night with a little monkey who doesn't sleep? I really miss sleep. When can I sleep, folks? I am so tired. But this is also a methodological and an epistemic question. It's an ethical and an ideological question. So this is obviously such a wonderful series to be invited to start thinking through these things. What does it mean to have shared a hugely meaningful experience with these women? How does this shape a deeper understanding towards a more radical critique? So I feel like this question operates along several dimensions. There's the methodological one. Can I still go hiking with the young Etat, which are fascist activists in Switzerland? Probably not. Particular avenues, ethnographic explorations, or getting in Twitter fights with Nazis may no longer be worth the risk. But in other ways, the shared experience is a site for investigation. Maybe if I'm interviewing trad wives with a baby on my hip, this opens up new places, new ways of discussing gender. Now, the question is also epistemic. Do we have a shared understanding of motherhood? Do we have different understandings? And where we have shared ones, what do we make of this common ground? This is the question I want to develop more towards the end of this talk. And finally, I think this question is political. What do you mean when your work makes you feel like the world is not good for kids? Or if you have a little girl, I think you are under some obligation to make the world better for her through this work, or make yourself better through this work, which is the same thing. I mean, for her, right? I am the world at this point. So uh, all of this, plus the systemic pressures of, how does one be a mom and how does one do academia, precarity, publication pressure? I wanted to start thinking about this. I didn't even actually finish typing it because my kid wanted to drink this afternoon. So I'm going to focus on the first three, but I think this kind of gives you an idea of a little bit the systemic challenges. So I think we talk about using critical ethnography beyond just doing field work in the woods with Nazis, focusing on kind of an ethnographic perspective without maybe necessarily doing this work, looking at shared experience as a site for studying ideologies, the stories we tell about them, their interpretation or take-up. So here, theorizing with Dorothy Smith's ideological codes, I think we can think about the feminist problematization of the everyday as a site for power. We can see motherhood stories as their own ideological codes, which organize both our participants and our own thinking. These kinds of structuring, ordering systems, we start thinking about motherhood, what automatically comes next, what automatically comes next, what roles, what powers. Things like the far right construction of love, this sort of ordering and hierarchizing of our thought. And I think this helps us see the shared story, a site of normalization of reactionary values and inequalities across the spectrum of the right wing, but also even the mainstream, perhaps our own lives, right? Dorothy Smith's whole research is about looking and saying, I'm studying the standard North American family, and I'm seeing ways in which my own research, my own life is also participating in this as a way then to get out of it, right? We also maybe want to see the far right as, as politically trying to impose these codes. They aren't just mainstream out of nowhere. They've been put on by powerful institutions. And maybe we want to look at the way the right is trying to impose these codes on us and to position ourselves as the real dissidents, the ones resisting them. So I think if we look at these codes, we can see the patriarchal uptake of motherhood. There's a far right story where this metaphor, the mother of the nation, this identity, this meaning or purpose, is kind of this smooth story that is so different from the brutal, the beautiful, actually sometimes quite boring thing that having a kid is. So this distinction between being a mother and having a kid. We can study the take-up of having a kid then as stories of motherhood. The far right one, where you are this kind of mother of the nation, the more broadly conservative one of motherhood as an identity, where the mom is always the main character, but somehow the meaning is always patriarchal. We might look more deeply at how that happens, and we might want to tell some new stories. We might want to ask, how do you keep your family safe from family values? We want to not just identify these overlaps then, but to change them. Obviously here I'm showing a little bit my Marxist identification, but if right-wing discourse has a monopoly on mom culture and a deep investment in this identity, so what's the alternative? How do you keep your family safe from these family values, the using of your experience, your life meaning, in reactionary social projects that involve hating gender, women, gays, and everything fun? Maybe you give up on the mom and you just go for the gender neutral parent, although sometimes that doesn't really seem to quite cover the fact that you grew a person from your body, which is cool. Or do you look for and build left-wing alternatives? So many of these parenting books, these discourses, these groups are just so right-wing coded. Where are the left alternatives? As a new mom, you can feel alienated, from those, but also from a lot of feminist discourse about being more than just a mom. But at the same time, you need these feminist values more than ever. You also need a partner who really does his work. My husband is right now with my baby, which is why I can be doing this talk. And I think it's important to always point out, the invisible labor that women do and the invisible labor that's there that supports us. So thanks to him, who obviously he's not here, so he can't hear me. And thanks to all of you for listening to me talk about this. And well, that's really all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kat, for such a great presentation. I loved everything that you said. I think it sparked a lot of thinking for me about obviously question that I never asked myself, not being a mom. But we have colleagues who are moms and researchers and trying to do everything at the same time. So I really like that you brought up this conversation for us to start thinking about. So if you have any question, you have the Q&A button below the screen. So you may want to start writing those, and then Kat will be able to address them. I do have one question, maybe to break the ice and give some time for our attendees to write down their questions. So I was really fascinated by the quotes and the story that you included in your presentation. And I found this idea of homeschooling as an act, well, a religious act of love, basically, right? But we could see also in the quotes some these notion of the condescending expert, right? These mom are way better fit to teach their children there than those experts who know nothing, basically. So it's also an act of rejection of the system, right? The corrupt system, I believe. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that, of how this would also, if it was part of the narrative, or if you would just frame this as a positive thing, right? I'm homeschooling my children because I know better, and it's an act of love and God and so on and so forth. Or would they also along the way just criticize the system and reject it?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Definitely, they were very suspicious of the system. This is actually how this writing came about, was that they didn't want to necessarily share their own words or a lot about themselves. Like, so I developed this way of doing these kind of composite portraits because they were so afraid, even of me as a researcher. I was like part of this system. They ended up calling me an agent provocateuse, which is obviously funny because that's bad French, but they were so obsessed with gender that like they couldn't even call me provocateur because they're that obsessed, right? And kicking me out of their groups at a certain point. They were very, very suspicious of the system. They would call schools forced adoption. And they would say that schools are really like ripping the family apart, stealing their kids away. And they really saw themselves, in this mission to like protect their children from schools, especially boys. There was this idea that schools, hate boys because they hate white men, they hate white Christian men, especially white Christian Southern men. So the teachers are there like really attacking their children and they really see them there as like defending, protecting, really this mama bear image. So I think this is part of what makes the role so like exciting and powerful for them, is that this kind of way of being like what the white nationalists would call a Viking shield maiden, right? This idea of like picking up the shield and defending your family and defending the children.
Yeah, super interesting. I do have another question, giving more time for our attendees to write down their question as well. I'm very intrigued by these ideas of like a mom researching other mom as well. I don't know if you were already pregnant or planning on becoming a mom while you did the field work, because I'm thinking like this could have influenced the kind of conversation you would have when talking with this woman, right? So did they talk about like the project of motherhood with you in sense like talking about you specifically? And would they provide unsolicited advice as well? And how did you use this as data if this is the case?
Yeah, yeah. So I wish that, right? So when I was doing the field work, I was very much not, uh, I was not planning. I had zero, right? Uh, So I had to like do all of these like subtle, like I would be like, I'm looking at schools, and they would just assume that I meant for my kid, and I'd be like, yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, for my kid. I wouldn't, just very much like if they wanted to assume that I had kids or was interested in kids or was like a normatively feminine person to them, I fully let these people. And that was also interesting to see like what they expected from me. But for a lot of these people, I was positioned fully as the opposite, as this sort of like academic, like representing this kind of like indoctrination and like the spinster, shrew teacher, liberal, the pink-haired communist, right? Like everything that they disliked. So I would sometimes lean into that and like go and do field work in like a Bernie Sanders 2016 t-shirt to see if they would like react, like be a little bit provocative in my own way, or like ask them things like, so what books would you ban if you could ban any books? And they would get really mad at me. Like just kind of trying to see if I could troll them back a little bit. And I think now I would not have the courage to do that. And I would want to instead lean into exactly what you're saying, like show up with Nico, my daughter, and be like, hi, hi. So like I just really want to know like where's the most like wonderful place to like teach my kid about love, and just see like what they do, like really lean into this sort of side of their self-conception.
If I can just like ask another follow-up question, and then I'll move to the question. I see that we have a few that are lining up in the Q&A. I'm just curious about this thing about using provocation in an interview setting. I think that this is also fascinating. I'm wondering how did they react it with, like, did you provoke them or would they try to convince you because of this provocation? How did this what were yeah, what did you observe when you were doing this? Did you manage to gather more interesting data due to this provocation or?
Yeah, especially with the Christian nationalists, they were really responsive to provocation. They like let themselves get trolled way too much. And I had some really interesting conversations with some homeschooling moms who were formerly like lawyers or like aerospace engineers. They really, I think they kind of also want to prove that they were smarter than me. So that, I read more books than you. And then they would tell me all the books they'd read. And I'd be like, wow, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of like literature supporting slavery, or like literature written in before 1850. Like, why are you so interested in this period before 1850? What could it be that is so, like, so you would learn a lot of things. Or they would tell me things about like, oh, but everything I think is so dark, and they just want to teach the light. And then like they would start going on about how light is so much better than dark. And you'd be like, wow, you really. So it ended up being very productive, but also very short. I wouldn't do it if you wanted to build like a long-term relationship with people. I'm not sure that like that kind of provocation without a certain amount of like mutual respect would be functional or possible, right? Like after this, like a couple of interviews with these people and like showing up to some of their meetings and provoking them, those relationships were not sustained. I mean, nor did I want to, right? Uh, and I think this was also possible in part because like I have a very normatively feminine. I was like, relatively young, and probably acted more like young and insecure when I was first doing my field work. And they would be like, "Oh, you're such a sweet little girl. Do you want to come over for like Christmas? Do you want to know the best like Catholic church to go where you can like wear the veil and do like the trad cath thing?" And they would have this like kind of maternal attitude towards me or like treating me like a young mom in their circle. So then I could do this, right? And I don't think that this is something I could do if I were, more like queer presenting or a woman of color or, non-binary or all these other things, right? Then so yeah, it was using a privilege that I had.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm going to build on that actually with a question that we have from one of the attendee asking, how does whiteness operate in the construction of the triad wife ideal?
Yeah, great. I mean, so this is my thing of both using this whiteness, but also feeling uncomfortable about like this shared whiteness, right? And like wanting to provoke and create this distance. And then also, right, this is something very important. I mean, the trad wife is fundamentally white. The whole thing about the trad wife is recoding white supremacy as desirable forms of gendered submission. So they're using desirable forms of like femininity and like you can have a cool hot girlfriend as a way to make white nationalism desirable to people. This was obviously really clear in the 2016 Tradwives, the Lana Lochtef, Lacey Lynn. And in the current iteration, the Ballerina Farm, S.D. Williams, it becomes a bit more subtle, but it's still definitely there, right? They perform. I mean, if someone is dressing up like it's 1950, they aren't just trying to sell you female submission, which they are, but they're trying to use female submission to make a world of segregation look desirable again.
Hmm. Right, I'm going to move to the next question right here. Were you able to sow the seeds of doubt into any of the moms you dealt with during the field work?
So the end of my PhD thesis recounts the absolute and total failure that I had to do this. I was like, on the side of doing this PhD research, I was like participating in Black Lives Matter movements and like doing socialist organizing. And I absolutely failed as a feminist organizer. I alienated some dear friends. They would say stuff like, "Oh, but I love to be submissive in the bedroom." And I'd be like, "What the fuck is wrong with you? Like, Karl Marx did not die for this." I was so angry with them. It did not help. Uh, I didn't know this idea of like being more than a mom that I had come into this research with saying like, "Oh, but women, they just they were like, why would I want to be more than the best thing that ever happened?" Like it just was not an effective thing. I think now, as a mom, understanding this, I would be maybe they are more able uh, to reach maybe not these women, but to reach other women who would potentially be drawn into this, right? I think once you are like a white nationalist woman, like, uh, you know, I don't know how to help you. And I'm not sure that like uh I want to be that person for you. But the people, other women who are struggling, who might be drawn into this, providing alternatives and different ways that they can go so that they don't get drawn into this would be something that's really important to me. How do we build left-wing moms communities so that if you're just like looking for some help finding a daycare, you find like a nice left-wing, like eco-socialist daycare. That would be my thing.
Hmm. Yeah, I find that this is interesting because in my own research, I also look sometimes at anti-gender movement online, and they do offer a lot for pregnant women, for instance, or for new moms, or for they're trying to build that community, right? But then along the way, they also offer like violence towards trans people, member of the LGBTQ plus community, disinformation, and so on and so forth. But I like there is this appeal though to women who might need support at some point in their life, and that's why it's so important that we offer alternative for these women and for the people in general, right? Okay, next question. Well, first, prop for doing this presentation, which made me laugh more than once with a 6-month-old. Now going to the question, I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the dichotomy between the necessary strength required for the conviction and push these women requires for their ideological space and the power dynamics of their traditional gender spaces.
Ah, yeah, this is a really good and deep question that would, I mean, I think requires a lot of thinking through. How is it that women can be so, they are very smart, right? And they are strong and they see themselves as very smart and very strong. They will be the first ones to tell you when you're interviewing them that they are experts. They would be very competitive with me about having read more books and, knowing more ancient Greek or, a lot of ancient Greek. I don't know any, so they could have been lying. Uh, and they were like they're people. They have skills and value. Uh, but they use this in the service of the perpetuation of a patriarchal system. Uh, and they have, different ways of doing this. Some of them will say it's, because they have boys and they love their boys and they want to raise those boys up to be strong men. And then so they are, gaining a certain amount of power and authority through this role. Um, some of it, I think, is that they are, just very racist. And so then they are submitting to male power, but then they are, gaining power in a capitalist racist system over other groups, over people who are, more working class, people who are Black, people or people of color. Or they're gaining power over their children, right? This is in this very hierarchical system. Submission to one kind of power gives you a power over everyone else who's below you in this system. So over your kids, right? Over your daughters in particular. Uh, and, what I think it is really worth looking more into how this system, though, creates the possibility for women to take their talents, their strength, and put it into this system in the service of their oppression. Uh, I think one thing I will say is that they often cast the women as really free thinking, right? She's the dissident mom or the mama bear against the school, right? This was a discursive position that the women were able to take up as right-wing women, but they didn't necessarily actually have, right? They would say, I'm a free thinker. But in fact, what they would teach their kids would be to repeat verses from the Bible over and over and over again. Or, they would fully, frame accepting, say, 1950s social imaginaries or religious values as free thought. But like, I don't know if that's really the same thing as actually being intellectually powerful and doing free thought. It's kind of just cosplaying in this way.
Right, moving to the next question. How do you reconcile feminist commitments to centering women's voice with the need to critically interrogate women who uphold exclusionary or harmful ideologies?
Hmm. I mean, I see this as a deeply feminist action. I was just listening this morning during my exercise to In Bed with the Right, which is an absolutely wonderful podcast I fully recommend to everyone. And they mentioned, they were talking about the history of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right, who is a problematic white feminist. And that feminism has always had this kind of internal critique of women and of the parts of the feminist movement that are, more about embodying whiteness to have power over other people in a social structure versus like uh, freedom for women meaning freedom for everyone, right? So this is, I think, just a deeply feminist thing to be thinking about through all these questions. And it's also a deeply feminist thing to say some of these women are shitty people, right? You have, as a woman, you have then a certain, we're going to say you have agency and power and choice in the world, and you made like bad choices with that power that you had. And I can say that I don't think you're cool. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm a bit judgmental. But that's I think that is something that we are allowed to say and still be feminists. And I think that it's important at the same time to understand the limits of certain kinds of feminist discourses, you know, uh, and where they don't work. for many women, so that we can move forward towards better, more equal futures for everyone. I think that the right and I both would have a moment of agreement where like, okay, girl boss lean in feminism was like not good. That was not a move towards equality, right? Bosses with pink power suits are still bosses. We don't need this. And so then understanding that we have this like superficial moment of agreement because we all hate the girl bosses, but I hate them because they're bosses and you hate them because they're girls, like we are not allies, right? So thinking about these discourses in a deeper way.
Yeah, I have a question that is actually rooted in what you were just saying. So, if you perceive this narrative as, well, were they reactive, like were they against feminism, like openly, or were they more trying to build this positive political identity during
Mm,
your fieldwork?
that's a really good question. So I would say that they would some of the like lightly conservative people who I didn't focus too much on would be talking about like we can do a conservative feminism. Like Christina Hoff Sommers, I think, talked about doing a conservative feminism, and then she gets taken up as based grandma by the far right, and it's like, I don't think you were that feminist then. But in general, they would be pretty anti-feminist, right? And I think it's this thing of the only thing I can really say right now off the top of my head is this idea of taking all the complexities because it's, being a feminist is complicated, being a mom is complicated, living weird, multifaceted. And then they give you really simple stories, right? They assemble these simple stories and then they naturalize them so they seem like they're deep or innate or meaningful. And then it becomes easy to kind of take them up and slot yourself into them, this kind of smooth story of like, I'm a wonderful mother, or, I'm a powerful fighter, joyful warrior for Christ, or whatever, these kind of nonsense things that they say. And then the complexities and the differences get pushed away. And if maybe we can pull on these kind of threads of what gets left behind, what are these complexities, we might be able to find people telling different, more unique, and quite frankly, like also more interesting stories.
Yeah. Thank you. Going in a bit of a different direction, but I like this question. So I'm thinking about how much child abuse there is in far-right Christian spaces. And did you see anyone argue for homeschooling, for instance, on the grounds that they could discipline children more aggressively?
Yes, they definitely, there was a lot of discussion of disciplining kids, a lot of discussion of like uh, deciding who your kids' friends were, which is another sort of um, uh, I think it's kind of abusive to like be so controlling over your kid. I didn't talk to a lot of people who were really into like beating your kids or like doing the like full Christian parenting thing. This is probably also because I don't have a Southern accent. So when I would talk to these women, there was like a certain amount of you're not exactly from here. And they might have been like worried to divulge things that could get like CPS called on them. But I'm sure there was a lot of discussion of like loving discipline and like making your child into who they were supposed to be. So to be a cis woman, a cis man, to be heterosexual. And I'm sure that, that is metaphorically quite violent. And I'm sure probably involved actually like quite a lot of physical violence in the home as well. Yeah, I don't think it was, you know, for all the things they talk about love, I'm sure that that love also involved quite a bit of physical uh, physical abuse.
Changing topic again, I feel like most of the questions are going in different directions. So thank you, Kat, for moving from one space to another. So the next question here, I'm going to read it. In my own work, when trying to explain and illustrate female far-right worldviews and activities, I typically find the audience assume and often try to convince me that these women aren't really far-right themselves. They are just victims of their racist husband or fathers. They don't really believe that. So have you also found audiences deny agency to extremist women? If so, why do you think people assume this? And how do you explain their agency?
Mm, this is a great observation. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. It's also very disrespectful of your own research. Oh no, these people that you're researching that you say are far right, they aren't really. It's like, are you sure? But there is this sort of thing of assuming that women only come to far right belief because of men. and that they can be led by men, especially politically. I mean, which is like ironically is a quite a conservative, even far right belief. So Lana Lochtef, one of the originators of the sort of trad wife movement online, she actually said that like these trad wife videos should be used by men to convert their girlfriends because we know that women are weak and only follow men. And I was like, you are yourself like a woman who radicalized your like who kind of weird conspiracy theorist Swedish husband into becoming like a full-on neo-Nazi. So there's a certain amount of disjunct there, right? Uh, I don't I typically then want to say stuff like maybe we don't recognize just how reactionary or radical some of these gender beliefs are because they seem to be broadly shared among a lot of like conservative, Christian, even certain like liberal mainstream folks. And then you can kind of turn it around on people and say like, "Hmm, that's interesting that you think this is normal. Like, are you okay? Do you need a friend? Like, tell me more."
Moving to the next question again. Is there benefits in focusing research on what they find threatening about the liberal gender and broader cultural changes? And what aspect of the right-wing cultural frameworks offers certainty, security, or empowerment?
Yeah, this is a really good question, a really good point. I mean, I
It's
think
all good
Andrew,
question. It's often
I
difficult to choose.
know. This I think this is like Andrea Dworkin's book, and this is an old feminist understanding of that like conservative right-wing women, they are this way to get protection, in a hostile patriarchal system. The idea is, submitting to a husband, finding like a powerful husband is the best solution you have to find security. That also then, of course, the rigidity, the certainty of these views. If you're, a very conservative Christian nationalist, you think you do this and like America is going to be great again and you're never going to die because Jesus loves you. Like, yeah, that sounds really secure, for sure that there is something to this, right? Uh, right now, as I'm thinking through this great question, I want to think about more. I think there's also something interesting about this, the childlikeness of this kind of view, right? And there's something about this idea of keeping, and the same with the previous question, there's this vision of like women as being always sort of girlish and childish, to be led by men into ideologies or being childish and needing certainties. And the women in my research, they didn't sell themselves to me this way. And I do think some of it was a bit like just they wanted to look cool, but they didn't seem to think of themselves this way. They saw themselves as dissidents seeing through the bullshit. So then maybe there's actually, through their own self-branding, there's a way to through this to say, listen, you don't need to be led by some man. You don't need to have these certainties. You are a real dissident thinker. So like, let's go beyond this. Maybe somehow you can keep going deeper until you go through and out into like a more liberatory form of thinking. Uh, or maybe that's overly optimistic.
Next question here. Do you see a transnationalization of far-right maternal activism? And if so, what do you think are some mechanisms through which this idea travels and become embedded in regional or local levels?
Oh, such a good question. This is something I'm researching at the moment, looking at the transnational circulation of anti-gender discourses, especially in these kind of like high liberal, multilingual European countries like Luxembourg and Switzerland. But this is something that I think there's a researcher, Christine Delegar, who's been looking at this since like the 1920s in the US. So like women's book clubs that would like conservative women's clubs that would get together and like buy bracelets for like anti-communist league, like let's support the anti-communists in Cuba or wherever. I don't remember exactly where it was. It was many years ago. I read this text. Was that, they would get together in the US and have these sort of groups to support, fascist or anti-feminist causes abroad. And there's always been these sort of like especially like women's transnational organizing. I think we can see this now with the trad wives. You see Brittany Pettibone now married to Martin Zellner, so she's an American trad wife, married to the leader of the Austrian neo-Nazi group Generation Identity, who then now come to Switzerland and are building relationships with the fascist groups there, who then build relationships with the fascist groups in Luxembourg, right? So they definitely do seem to be like doing this work and making these transnational alliances, sometimes quite literally through marriage.
Okay, next. Next question. I think there's a word I don't understand, so maybe there's a language barrier here, but I'm gonna try to do my best. So as you said, these moms frame their homeschooling as focusing on the light instead of the dark, and far right tends to glamorize and romanticize motherhood. So for me, it resonates with the thesis that the far right seeks to, I think, re-encant the world. That's the word I'm struggling with. You can have a look at the Q&A, Kat, if you want to see it. So does it mean that any critique and feminist critique of far-right motherhood entails being a killjoy and disencanting the world for these mothers and other far-right people in general?
Okay, so this idea, right? This is a question I really want to think of. So, think about this question of how is it that like hierarchies of gender, which do not seem to me to be magical in any way, right? Like men better, women not so good. Like, how is this enchanting? How is this magical? Like, I do not see like a lot of work went into making this something special and magical and Disney princess, whatever. Uh, and I'm interested in unpacking that work that is done. And then maybe once we've really unpacked the way in which this sort of enchantment is semiotically accomplished, we can turn around to people and say, like, it's interesting, right? That yeah, be a killjoy, be a feminist killjoy in the Sarah Ahmed sense and say, like, no, like, look at no, no, no. But then if we're gonna do this, I think we need our own much more enchanting, much more real, much more beautiful things to offer people. Because like you can't go around to people and be like, I'm gonna kill your joy and not give you anything in return, right? You know, you need to also say like this joy is inauthentic. No one is gonna actually get joy out of like submitting to like, patriarchy. That sounds unpleasant. So here is instead something that is much more beautiful, much more creative, much more artistic. And, I think that this is something that the left we have. I mean, we have like good stories and good music, and the right has Deuce Bigelow, male gigolo. I mean, like it's not cool. So there is something we have to draw on here for that.
Thank you. We have two questions left. If you still have time to energy to address these. So first one, did any of the triad wives ever articulate dissatisfaction with their lifestyles?
Ah, great question. So not to me, because again, I had this kind of like oppositional framing. They were like, I'm better than you. I'm really happy, and you are a miserable feminist. And I was like, it's funny you say that because I really like my life. Uh, I liked it then. I like it also now, and it's, less outwardly feminist seeming, but maybe more feminist in its heart. Uh, it's they put up a front. And I think this is also something that they're taught to do in, especially in the Christian, like evangelical, right? You have to put on like a good front for God and, sort of evangelize and say like, well, if so if you're like unhappy and you're like, I feel actually quite guilty hitting my kid. I really don't like it. That doesn't put the right front for people. Um, and I'm also really suspicious of the more famous, like former trad wives. I've never got to talk to Lauren Southern. She's way too cool for me. Uh, the blonde in the belly of the beast used to troll me a lot on Twitter, but that's the only trad wife who talks to me. What's her name? Becky is her real name, Becky Hargreaves. Uh, they uh she's like, oh, I was so sorry. I was so mistreated by men as a trad wife, and I was a white nationalist, but now I'm not really. I'm something complicated. I'm not left. I'm not right. It's like, girl, you made a documentary about how like black people in South Africa are doing the great replacement, like whatever. Like you are a terrible person. You did terrible stuff, and now you're like, oh, but also like men weren't that nice to me, and so like you want to like gain a second act. It seems to me really fake, and also like mm, I feel like you should maybe have to like do a little bit more repentance and thinking before you get to be celebrated again, and like also like I don't know, this kind of or held up as this like martyr victim savior thing. I don't I hope they're dissatisfied, all of them. They should be, I think is the right answer for that question.
All right. Other question, is there a research measure of social or emotional contagion and group psychology in crystallizing such ideologies? More into the like the psychology
Uh,
side of things.
I wish I don't know anything about that way of doing research, but I do notice that there was like a flurry of real interest around trad wives and these articles that would always say, do women really want to be trad wives? And these articles always sort of centered our presumed desire to be a trad wife, which I found incorrect and really leading right on behalf of the media. Like just because some women were like the questions were, why are women making money doing trad wife stuff, or why are women using femininity to sell right-wing ideologies, or you know what's with farms and ballerina. They were always, do you really want to be a trad wife? This idea that it's women's desire or somehow our tradition, our nature, they kind of took this all for granted. And so it was sort of this media panic and this media contagion, this like invented desire. And so there I found this like discursive invention of desire interesting. I don't know uh, what people feel in their hearts, and don't. Uh, I wouldn't like to be psychologized myself. If someone said, "Oh, she's just a feminist because she's too ugly and bitter, and that's why," it would hurt my feelings. So I also want to do them the same, like not do them that epistemic violence. And I want to just look at what are their words, what do their words do, what are these institutions, and how do these institutions make people want to insert themselves, not want to, sorry, make people able to insert themselves and tell these kinds of stories. I don't know like what's really inside their hearts. And I'm not sure if we always do either ourselves.
Great answer. I know I promised that there was the only two last question, but now we received one more, and I kind of like it, so I'm going to ask you. But this is the last. How would you address issues of actor connectivity? So are these moms explicitly linked to other far right and supremacist groups? So is there a link, and is this link something we suppose but cannot prove, or can we actually demonstrate it? And then thank you so much, fantastic research on your part.
Thanks for the wonderful question. So yes, these folks are connected. I personally ask a guy named Piotr who does a network analysis, and he's really good at it. He helps me lately. So I would say make your own researcher networks. It's a wonderful way to do it. But right-wing women, they have, especially as the kids get a bit older, they seem to have a lot of time. They seem to be really involved in networks. So someone like the dissident mama, she shaped a network of like neo-Confederates, of philosophers, of like right-wing academics, and she does these podcasts, these blogs, this kind of organizing work. So a lot of this work, they will say community is the traditional woman's battleground, and they're really invested in building and supporting and doing this community and building these networks, both like within the US and transnationally. And they're quite sneaky and kind of humble about it, but I think that they do a lot of work, and it's worth looking at them uh, more closely.
All right, that was all the time that we had. But thank you so much, Kat, for being so generous in answering our questions. Do not miss the next webinar. It will be the last webinar of this academic year. So it's on May 21st. We'll have host Adrienne Massanari, who will discuss how gaming spaces have become fertile soil for far-right recruitment and mobilization. So do not miss this webinar. Yeah, see you soon then.
Thank you.